What
Absolutely.
does that look like? What are some common effects of trauma in a relationship?
Well, first of all, trauma can be anything, right? So we got to
Anything.
make sure we define trauma. Trauma can be, and it's all specific to that person, right? So
Totally.
I can grow up with a two-parent household in the suburbs
Mhm.
and feel traumatized by my upbringing, right?
Mhm.
Because it's all based around your needs, right? So the things that causes trauma are going to be all around parenting, right? Unless you're talking about
Mm.
obviously severe trauma, which is sexual abuse and some type of physical abuse or some type of emotional abuse. But what I'm talking about when I say trauma can be as small as my mom didn't teach me how to trust others,
Mhm.
right? My mom didn't teach me how to love myself. My mom didn't teach, or dad, if you have your dad there, but my parents didn't teach me how to be in an interdependent relationship where I had to rely on somebody else and show up and do my part,
Mhm.
right? My parents didn't teach me how to attune to not only my emotions but to someone else's emotions, right? In other words, I don't know how
Mm.
to work in the midst of a system. I'm only knowing how to work with what I know. I do it for myself. When you see somebody coming and say I can do it for myself, you already know they're coming from a level of trauma. If it's not childhood trauma, it's coming from trauma from a relationship. Because you
Mm.
should never
Whoa.
think that you want to do anything by yourself, right? That comes
Wow.
from putting your walls up, right? So that's what I consider the smaller levels of trauma that happens more often than not. Now, of course, the severe trauma that I just talked about with sexual abuse and neglect and abandonment, just physical,
Mhm.
that's a whole different level, right? But all the trauma is dealt with the same way though, because it affects you the same way, right?
Right.
So what happens when you get into a relationship and you have not processed or even identified your trauma? What you're doing now is walking to that relationship and expecting your partner to be what your parents should have been or what your last person who traumatized you should have been. So
Mm.
you're not coming into the relationship with a blank slate. And what happens is that person now has to pay for what the other person has done,
Mm.
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And that
Wow.
still takes the accountability off of you. It's your responsibility to deal with your trauma. Right? But see, watch this though. The magical part, what I'm saying all night is the person who's with you, if they're healthy, they would identify that within the first 10 dates.
The first
It's
10,
true.
10.
First 1-0. If I go out with you 10 times and I don't realize that you have childhood trauma that has not been processed, I'm not asking you the right question.
Boom. Be sure to stay connected with us during the week through our weekly podcast on Spotify, our YouTube channel, Patreon, and social media. See?
We're just having fun, and you know what having fun means. We're
Yep.
we're, we're just getting together, kicking it, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And even then, it's going to be hard for you not to let your trauma slip out.
That's
Mm.
true.
so,
That's true.
so
That's true. It's coming. It's showing up like a unexpected guest always.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Popping up like, who the hell are you? Oh, hey, I'm Trauma.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And you're
Here
never,
I am.
and you're never going to have a successful relationship with unprocessed trauma.
Ooh wee.
Mhm.
Right.
Ooh
You're never
wee.
going to have it, right? Because at some point, if you have unprocessed trauma, then all you're operating on in your relationship is trauma responses. Right?
Mm.
So
Whoa.
every
Now,
time you're triggered, you're going out doing something unhealthy. That's your coping mechanism, right?
Mm.
let's get into these trauma bonds now.
There
What
you
does
go.
that look like? Because a lot of people swear that, they made that connection, but it's a trauma bond now. You got your trauma, I got my trauma, and now we think it's love because we've been traumatized.
Yeah, and it's a true bond. So it's more addictive than actual crack, right? So
Ooh,
when you get with someone and they don't even have to have similar trauma, as long as they have trauma. I mean, they coming
trauma.
from a
Yeah.
deficit.
Mhm.
Now, at some point, you guys are relating to that part, right? And not relating to
Mm.
your goals. Remember, anything that's going to take you off your goals is going to be something that's going to be negative and unhealthy. Trauma only focuses on the past, right? Because the trauma happened in the
Mhm.
past.
Right.
So if you're trauma bonding with somebody, you're only
Ooh.
trauma bonding with your older self, which means that you guys can never truly grow effectively together because the only way you guys can relate is through the past.
Mm.
OMG.
Right.
Head
Well,
blown.
So, so
what
I want
role?
to relate with somebody about where we're going, not where we've been, right?
Right.
Mm.
All right.
Well,
Mm.
what role
Mm.
does therapy play in overcoming the trauma in a relationship?
It identifies it for one, because healthy is going to be the inability to adhere to an interdependent relationship, whether it's with you and yourself or you and another partner. So once you have conflict and you don't have the process to get over conflict, right? Now you know trauma must be a part of it, because trauma prevents you from having healthy responses and conflict resolution, right? So
Conflict resolution.
right, because no
That
one
is
ever
our
said that you're
word
not
of the
going to have
day.
conflict. You're
Right.
gonna always have conflict, right? So
Mhm.
so if you go into a relationship thinking conflict is not going to happen, you're sadly mistaken. But I'm not going to go into a relationship thinking that we can't get past our conflict. So for instance, I have a motto, and I teach this to my clients. I can have 1,500 problems as long as there are 1,500 individual problems, and I can deal with all 1,500. But I'm not going to have one problem that I talk about 1,500 times.
Right. Yeah. That's
Right.
crazy.
I'm not going to do that. That's
It's crazy,
I
right?
mean, someone's not talking and someone's not listening, and that's going to be my red flag that you have some trauma, because you cannot change. Remember, when somebody's stuck and they can't move forward, even with accountability and change behavior, then something in their past is stopping them from doing that. Right? It's a trauma.
Mm.
They're in
Ooh.
self-preservation mode.
Thank you for listening to Soulful Conversation. We hope you enjoyed tonight's soulful conversation. Be sure to stay connected with us during the week through our weekly podcast on Spotify, our YouTube channel, Patreon, and social media. And don't forget to send in those soulful requests to be heard on the podcast at info@soulful-conversation.com.